Cameras were briefly allowed in to see the largely ceremonial meeting that followed many hours of backroom negotiations.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to London. The sun is just coming out.
Both sides trumpeted this as a new chapter in relations.
It's time to move on from the stale old debates and political fights to focus on delivering common sense, practical solutions which get the best for the British people.
My dear Keir, this is a historic moment because it is the first ever EU-UK summit and it is a success.
To improve access to the EU market and reduce form filling, the UK will accept current and future EU food rules. The UK would be consulted before the EU changed its laws, but not have any veto. EU fishing rights in UK waters will be extended for a further 12 years from next year.
It's simple. The fishing industry's been sold up the river again, haven't they?
Yeah, nothing's changed for 12 years, so the only loser here is the UK fishing fleet.
From some in Brixham in Devon, the reaction the government feared. But John and Sarah Homeyard, who export mussels to Europe, hope this means the end to lengthy paperwork and delays, and their catch suddenly being banned because water quality has dipped one grade on the EU scale.
That's really good news. I mean, it takes us back to where we were before. If we can go back to the previous arrangement of exporting, that'd be very welcome, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be a huge benefit to us, and it'll just add, a bit of a level of certainty and allow us to continue our business and actually help with forward planning and, developing our business into something bigger and better.
Fisheries was a target issue for the Leave campaign. Since Brexit, many fishing communities feel their interests have been traded to keep negotiators from countries like France at the table.
Okay. Despite some of the positive benefits that the deal represents, the overarching feeling is one of disappointment. I think there's a large feeling that many of the promises that were made 7 years ago in the run-up to the Brexit referendum have been largely reneged upon.
Keir Starmer's government has surrendered many of the gains we secured: our sovereignty, our money, and control over our laws to the European Union.
Britain is also accepting EU rules on carbon-intensive goods and electricity to gain access to the EU markets. The government's continuing talks on a youth mobility scheme, but is refusing to call it that. UK defence companies may get the chance to bid for giant EU contracts, part funded by EU loans. Many details here, as elsewhere, are still to be agreed.
It's very much a starting point, I think. A lot of things need to be hammered out, and actually negotiations are going to continue to quite some time before any kind of final deal is going to be done.
At a time of global instability, and when our continent faces the greatest threat it has for generations, we in Europe stick together.
Keir Starmer whisks the President of the European Commission and her European Council President colleague off to HMS Sutherland for lunch.
Slope arms.
Britain will have to pay a yet-to-be-determined fee to access the EU loans mechanism for defence projects if such a deal is agreed. Keir Starmer said all his judgment calls were intended to secure UK jobs.
This deal is a win-win. It delivers what the British public voted for last year. It gives us unprecedented access to the EU market.
Labour said it would try to repair the damage of Boris Johnson's Brexit deal, which the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility has estimated could take 4% off Britain's GDP. Today's deal, giving UK agriculture access to EU markets in return for obeying EU laws, is projected by independent experts to add about 0.08% to GDP over 10 years. The deal, accepting EU rules on energy, could add an additional 0.05% to GDP. Together on these estimates, they repair around 1/30 of the damage.
To be honest, it's relatively minor from an economic growth and GDP perspective. I think if you look at the deal, yes, the agricultural deal can help on the margin and will help that sector, but it's a relatively small sector of the economy, so it's not going to make a huge difference. So on the whole, I don't think this really makes a huge difference to economic growth or GDP. And I think what we're seeing is both sides talking this up because it suits them.
The microphones caught Keir Starmer saying the most important thing is we got there.
The most important thing is we got there.
The deadline was met with a 25-page document of political agreement, which Number 10 says will boost British jobs. But hard legal agreement will take longer.
And Gary's with me now. So how good a deal has Keir Starmer cut?
Well, there are some puzzles, some questions going on here. How was it that only a few days ago we were hearing that the number of years extension that European fisheries could get to the old agreement would be about 4 years? Suddenly it's 12. Was there good sort of craft, as it were, trade craft from the people in this government, basically letting the Europeans know that they were desperate for a deal, and maybe the Europeans smelt sweat at the last minute and moved on this? And are they really learning from that? Because the emphatic way that Keir Starmer talked about e-gates being available to British tourists going around Europe this summer was maybe a little overconfident. This comes down to individual countries. Is there a danger of over-promising there and not learning perhaps from the last 72 hours? I think one of the other takeaways from all of this, though, is that, do you remember, all the way through the Brexit referendum and the aftermath, we were told there would be a full-fat US-UK free trade agreement. It was one of the great things that was promised to voters, and that truly died today. Because Keir Starmer often says he doesn't have to choose between Europe and the United States, but on trade, he chose Europe today quite decisively because that food agreement with Europe means he cannot have the full fat agreement with America that includes American food goods. The other big question that you come away wondering about is how far does Keir Starmer really want to take this? Are there other sectors he would like to, as it were, creep into the single market on, accept EU jurisdiction in return for access? Pharmaceuticals, chemicals perhaps? And we don't know the answer to that, and truly probably Keir Starmer doesn't himself. He's waiting to see how this one goes down.
Gary Gibbon. Well, just before we came on air, I spoke to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, and I asked him if this was a political gift to reform and the Tories.
No, it's complete nonsense, Christian. It's a political gift to the British people, because this is a good deal building off the back of our deal with India and the United States for British jobs, for bills and for borders. And quite frankly, the Conservatives and Reform are talking utter nonsense.
Well, so there's no dynamic alignment?
So there's dynamic alignment, but why are they
So we are taking rules?
No, there's an independent dispute resolution process for any arguments about how rules are aligned. And if there's a question on European law, then the European court decides in the same way. If there's ever a question on UK law, the UK court decides. This is quite a technical process, which is perfectly standard in trade agreements. And the fact that that lot on the right of British politics are crying surrender just shows they are not a serious party for government and shouldn't be listened to.
Do you think this is the beginning of a process by which Britain does more and more sectoral deals with Europe? Or is this as good as it gets when you're outside the European Union?
So this is a good start. We've committed to meeting every year for an annual EU-UK summit. You've seen in the trade deal today there are some things where we've got more work to do, where we want to, for example, on the youth exchange scheme and procurement in the defence programme, which we will come back to. But of course, within our red lines, we're not rejoining the customs union, we're not rejoining the single market, but do we want to improve trade?
I mean, you would like to, but you're not going to.
But do we want to improve trade relations with the EU? Of course we do, because that is good for the British people, for their jobs, and for the price of the food products they've got on the shelves in their supermarkets.
What's it going to cost us?
Which bit?
Well, we have to pay, as we understand it, something for whatever work the European Union has to do in order to integrate us.
Yeah.
So what is it going to cost Britain?
So there's a couple of schemes where you have to make an administrative contribution. This is not paying into the EU budget. We're not paying into the EU budget because we're not part of the EU. But where we are administering schemes, then we have to contribute to the cost of administering that. That's perfectly normal when you have schemes. Well, we'll work out that detail in due course because it relates to some of the things where we've got more detail to agree.
But it's billions.
Well, I wouldn't recognise that figure. I mean, look, let's get the
Hundreds
detail.
of millions? I mean, give us a ballpark.
Well, look, let's take an example. The youth exchange scheme, we've got to figure out the detail of that. We know it's going to be visa-based, time-capped for young Europeans or young British people to move between countries for a couple of years. Of course, there's an administrative cost of administering the visas in our relevant Home Office and Home Office counterpart, and therefore the scheme costs are in relation to that type of thing. But we'll be able to publish the costings of those once we've fully got the details sorted with our European counterparts.
And do you have any idea of how many European people will come into Britain once that scheme is up and running?
Well, we're quite clear that we want the scheme to be capped and controlled. This is not free movement. It's exactly the same scheme we have with...
do we get to choose what the cap is, or is that a negotiation?
Well, that's what we're working through with the European Union. But we want the same scheme we have with the Australians and the Kiwis and other countries around the world.
But there's a lot more Europeans than there are Australians and Kiwis.
Sure, yeah, but if you cap it, then of course you can control the flow of that process. As I say, this is not free movement. I think it's a good story for young people.
But you don't know how many people it's going to lead to, basically.
That's the detail we've got to sort out.
Right, and in terms of the growth that this, the reducing of, non-tariff barriers will give us, can you put a cost on that? How much is Britain going to get from this?
So the estimate at this stage is about £90 billion of economic contribution to the UK.
There's going to be £90 billion over how long?
Until 2040 is the time frame that people have assessed.
Long time.
Then. Sure, but good, right? I mean, we wouldn't say no to that.
But how does that compare to the damage economically of Brexit?
Oh, well, look, you know that leaving Brexit has cost us more than that, but we're not relitigating that argument today. It was a long time ago. What today is about improving our trade and security relationship with the EU, because we were left with a rubbish deal by Boris Johnson. We're doing that because it's good for British jobs, for how much we pay for things in our shops, helps us control the borders. There's important policing partnerships in the deal today as well. And that is a good first step in improving our trade and security relationship.
I mean, look, obviously half the country is going to think this is great, and half the country is going to think this is a betrayal. And politically, it's a very odd situation you got yourself into when Nigel Farage is leading the opinion polls. Last week you banged on about immigration. This week you're banging on about the EU. It's like you're signing your own suicide note.
I don't buy that at all. It's very defeatist, Christian. The thing that I think is that the majority of the British people, in fact, probably all of them, are going to celebrate the fact that they're going to have more produce in their supermarkets at lower prices. And if you work in parts of the country where, for example, you're exporting salmon, as we've seen from the salmon industry into the EU, that's good for local jobs and good for local businesses. This is a pragmatic deal that is good for trade, reduces prices and helps us to control our borders. There's nothing you can really disagree with in that, and that's why Nigel Farage and the Conservatives are all harping on about this being a surrender. I mean, it's complete nonsense, and they should grow up if they want to be more involved in the politics of governing our country.
Darren Jones, thank you very much. Well, as we've heard, increased cooperation on defence is a critical part of the new deal with the European Union. Both sides are committed to sharp increases in their spending on military power, driven by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Trump's demand that Europe looks after itself. But the extra investment could also provide a boost for countries desperate for faster growth. Our economics correspondent Helia Ebrahimi reports.
A world full of threats requires a larger response. Today, the EU and Britain accepted that means closer ties between European allies, one that's about jobs and wealth as well as placating the White House, and where British companies can access the EU's new mega defence fund. Here in this chamber, they're testing the signal from one end of the room to the other to see if defence equipment really measures up in the real world. Today's summit is a little bit like that, measuring the signal from Britain to the EU to see if this new defence pack measures up in our spiky new world.
It's transformational. We've not seen this level of investment coming into defence in Europe in decades, not since the Second World War.
The boss at Leonardo UK, which employs 8,500 people here, welcomed today's pact.
For the first time, we've seen significant movement of capital and talk of €150 billion being made available on top of another €600 billion from the nation state.
For the Prime Minister, who came to Leonardo's just a few weeks ago, this could lead to some much-needed growth.
Hello.
The defence industry currently contributes 10 times more than fishing. So with a big expansion on the cards, he knows British industry can't afford to be left out. For more than 6 decades, the UK has been spending less and less of its national income on defence, with the European Union pitching in an even smaller share. That era is now over, with plans to push to 3% and beyond by 2030. To get there, the EU will commit €800 billion, the bulk from member states. But there'll also be a new €150 billion credit fund, backed by the European Commission.
We see what the Chinese are doing in terms of growth of their shipbuilding capability. Yeah. We see what Russia's done in terms of changing its economy onto a war footing and the amount of GDP it's spending. A lot of people said that's unsustainable, but they haven't stopped sustaining it yet. So those threats are significant, and we need to be able to respond to those industrially, militarily, but also intellectually.
Does it all lead in the end, Clive, do you think, to a European army?
I think that's a choice for the politicians. I don't see that happening at the moment, but looking at our defence and industrial base, we've got to ensure that we're not competing against ourselves.
The traditional argument is that defence spending promotes cutting-edge research, which filters around and around the economy, as well as making state-of-the-art military kit.
It's advanced mainly because of its very small size and weight, as you can see, and we're the first in the world to put jamming technology into such a small payload. So this is the real brains of it. This is the part that I personally work on. This little box can actually produce hundreds of ghost images of Typhoon jets, so it would appear to the radar operator as if they've got a whole squadron of jets coming at them. They've no way of knowing which, if any, is a real target, so they are deceived and confused long enough that your piloted jets can then go in behind Brightstorm, carry out their mission and return safely.
At the other end of the spectrum to Leonardo is Skyroll, a defence startup that already has contracts with the MOD. They're keen today's pack supports smaller companies as well as the industrial behemoths.
Modern warfare is fought with software predominantly. We still need the hardware, but that innovation and the investment within those new technologies what will allow us to fight the modern war.
Governments haven't been willing to put their money where their mouth is. Has that shifted?
I think it is shifting. I don't think it's shifted yet.
Today's partnership will not yet unlock billions in cash for UK companies. Instead, it's a roadmap of how to get there. The government's defence review, set to be published imminently, may create a better view of what Britain will build itself and what can be achieved in collaboration.
Well, earlier back in the studio, I spoke to Keir Starmer, who was Estonia's Prime Minister and is now the EU's High Representative for External Affairs, their Foreign Secretary, if you like, and Vice President of the European Commission. I asked her if this was the beginning of a closer relationship or the end.
Well, we have a lot of room where we can cooperate. We are the logical partners if you look at the situation globally. When it comes to security, when it comes to different issues. We are very close, and of course we need to see how our relationship grows.
So the European Union has effectively done a sectoral deal over agriculture and carbon markets. Do you think it could also do similar deals over other bits of the European Union, chemicals or industry, or, could we start cherry picking a little bit more?
Well, every deal is a compromise on both sides, and of course, I can say that talking to the member states, the wounds of Brexit are still there. So I think it was a lot of effort to have this very concrete security and defence partnership. There are a few other topics. But I think it always comes with a lot of pain. The discussion.
So there was a lot of pain in Europe at doing a deal with Britain.
Because, like I say, the wounds
people are angry.
No, people are not angry. I mean, I come from a country that really cherished the relationship we had with the UK and still have with the UK. And there are a lot of countries like this in Europe. But there are also a lot of countries who are seeing that, okay, you wanted to leave, so you are out, and you can't cherry pick, the good things out of European Union when we have a lot of issues.
Is that why the fishing became so important? The Europe felt it needed to get something back.
Well, the fishing, I mean, the agreement would be, over next year anyhow. So we would have to negotiate the new deal anyhow.
But do you see that as a win?
You know, it is every deal is a win for both parties. If you think about but I mean, what your prime minister was stressing,
I mean, because the debate here is about is that a loss for Britain and a win for Europe?
No,
is that how you see it?
No, I don't see it like this. All in all, it's a compromise. Now both parties are happy.
Does Britain look to you like a country that could forge a closer and closer relationship with the European Union?
We are very like-minded partners when it comes to, values, when it comes to, seeing the world the similar way, then we are very like-minded partners.
Do you think we could rejoin?
That is up to the British people to decide. Well,
it's also up to the European Union.
Yeah, it is, but it's. Your Brexit happened. The decision was 2016. I remember it very clearly because I was in the European Parliament at that time. I mean, we were very sad that you left or you were leaving, but it was your decision, your people's decision. So it is also your people's decision if you want a closer relationship with us. And if you do, then of course we're going to negotiate and negotiate not from the place where we left, but from the new grounds that we are right now.
You also then know Nigel Farage from that period, and he is now leading the opinion polls in this country. He could be Prime Minister. Does that make you think, well, there's no point really engaging with Britain because he's going to be Prime Minister in 4 years and unravel it all?
No. We have to work with whoever is elected. We see a lot of cooperation points there.
We're in a situation now where Donald Trump could either announce some sort of peace conference with Russia and Europe, and Ukraine rather, or walk away effectively from the process. If he were to walk away, how does this new agreement make it any more likely that Europe can step into that gap?
We are also cooperating on helping Ukraine, and we will do what we have done so far. I mean, putting pressure on Russia so that they would also want peace.
That pressure being what?
That pressure being, more sanctions on energy, for example, banking sector. I think we are reaching a point where actually the Russian military industry, has to start the production from the means that they don't have in their warehouses, but they need to rely on the supply chains. So we see more how these supply chains will also influence Russia in their thinking about this war. And the other part, what we need to do on the side is help Ukraine to defend itself, because we have no other option.
Can I finally ask you, as the EU's High Representative, your view of what's going on in Gaza right now and Israel's clear aim to still take over?
Our point is that humanitarian aid must reach immediately the people. It can't be militarized, it can't be politicized, because we have the international law in place, what says how you need to act. And it is mostly European-funded trucks that are behind the border and can't reach the people that are in dire need.
Do you think Gaza is at risk of genocide?
I mean, the situation there is so grave that we need to do everything that people are saved. The loss of life is untenable.
High Representative, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Well, with me now here in Westminster, the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Daisy Cooper, and also the Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury, the Conservative MP, Gareth Davis. Gareth Davis, the promise to get rid of barriers for agri-foods was in the Labour manifesto. If this was a Brexit betrayal, it's one people voted for.
I'm not sure that's entirely the case. I think if you look at the provisions of this agreement, it encompasses lots of different ways in which we're going to be taking EU laws, taking EU standards, having the ECJ overbear on the United Kingdom. This is not what people voted for, to be fair, and I think that's why this is a weak deal.
Daisy Cooper.
Look, today is a good step forward. It's a good first step towards rebuilding the relationship with the EU.
You want more?
And undoing the damage that the Conservatives left behind. Yes, we Liberal Democrats do want more. We want to see a fully fledged youth mobility scheme. We want to see a UK-EU customs union to really boost British businesses. And we want to see closer cooperation on security as well.
I mean, when you talk about, this going against the Brexit idea, I mean, do you not see the economic benefits? Or do you think this is where the principles of Brexit trump the economy?
Well, Brexit was about...
And the economic damage doesn't matter.
Taking back control of our laws, of our standards, and having the ability to launch into new free trade agreements with some of the fastest growing countries in the world. What this does, by tying us into EU law, back into EU law, that ties our hands behind our backs when we're trying to enter these new trade agreements. So it takes us back, actually, all while selling out our fishing industry.
That British businesses already want to export to the EU. And in order to do that, they have to abide by many of these rules anyway. So since Brexit, the UK and the EU have been aligned on many of these standards. So that isn't really going to change. What we really want to see, and why Liberal Democrats are calling for a bespoke UK-EU customs union, is so that we can get rid of all of the red tape that is wrapping up our small businesses and holding them back from doing more business with the EU.
I mean, tonight, in there, Keir Starmer has told his MPs that reform are now the main opposition to the government. I mean, you are shrinkingly relevant in this conversation, aren't you?
Well, I don't believe that's the case. In fact, we're the ones who are putting forward robust opposition to this very weak deal by a very weak Prime Minister. If you just look at the billions of pounds that this is going to cost the taxpayer, for what? For what? You go to coastal communities represented by Liberal Democrat members of Parliament, I'm pretty sure the people who work in the fishing industry there or any coastal community will be appalled by this deal. And it's the Conservatives who stand, as it's demonstrating tonight,
is £90 billion of added growth over the period up until 2040. You just reject that, would you, and say, well, Brexit's more important?
No, I would say that we want a good agreement which doesn't sell out a key industry for the United Kingdom.
But you got a bad one,
and
that's the trouble, wasn't it?
I don't believe that's the case. I think what we are doing, and what we did in government, is reach out to the fastest growing parts of the world to forge new relationships. That's what I think we should all be focused on, not rehashing old debates of the past, which is what the Liberal Democrats and Labour want to do.
Daisy Cooper, aren't you and Labour walking into the reform trap that has been set now? That, you know, you say you want to get closer and closer, and half the country or so, or maybe a bit less, well, you know, whatever the figures are right now, think it's betrayal. And you're lining yourself up for another nightmare at the next election in which we all relitigate the nightmare of Brexit.
The only betrayal,
in terms of the referendum.
The only betrayal was the botched Brexit deal left by the Conservatives that wrapped up businesses in red tape, that left struggling families with higher prices and took opportunities away from young people to live, work and travel around Europe. We don't want to relitigate the arguments of the past. We don't want to return to those Brexit battle lines that divided our communities, our families and our country. We're looking to the future.
But there's a reason they're ahead in the polls, isn't there?
Well, I think the reason Reform are ahead in the polls is because the country as a whole haven't forgiven the Conservatives for the mess they left behind. They're really deeply frustrated at many of the early decisions that the Labour government has made, and they're looking for alternatives. But I think if we look at British politics over the last few years, we can see that our politics is very febrile. It's very, people are willing to change their votes to other parties, depending on what parties are willing to offer. And what we're saying very clearly is we don't want to relitigate the arguments of the past and fight yesterday's wars like the Conservatives and Reform. We're looking to the future. We want to boost our economy, make things cheaper for struggling families and boost British businesses, and that's why we're pushing the Labour government to go even further.
Daisy Cooper, Gareth Davis, thank you both very much indeed.